Police discover horrifying secret in evil wife's bedroom. The rain pelted against the squad car as Detective James Carter arrived at the suburban home. A call from the neighbors had sounded strange. A missing husband, an eerie silence, and faint, metallic odors seeping through the walls. James stepped out into the night, his boots squelching in the mud. The house stood tall and shadowed, with curtains drawn tightly, as if hiding secrets from the world. The porch creaked under his weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet storm. Inside, the living room was pristine. Too pristine. Photos of the couple adorned the walls. Her radiant smile, his slightly hesitant grin. But something felt off. The neighbors had said she was unusually calm for someone whose husband had disappeared without a trace. James approached the bedroom door. A faint, sweet yet sickly smell wafted through the cracks, curling around his nostrils like a sinister whisper. His heart pounded. He reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a chill through his fingers. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit room. The walls were painted a warm beige, the furniture tasteful and orderly. But the smell was stronger now, overwhelming, clawing at his senses. A large, antique chest sat at the foot of the bed, its surface gleaming under the weak light. Something about it felt wrong. James knelt before the chest, his hands trembling as he unclasped the latch. It groaned open, revealing hair, human hair, bundles of it, tied neatly with ribbons in various shades and lengths. His breath hitched, his mind racing to make sense of it. But that wasn't the worst. Beneath the hair were photographs, dozens of them, men, each one smiling, each one standing beside her. Her radiant smile unchanged in every photo. James's stomach churned as he lifted the photographs to reveal a blood-stained journal beneath them. The pages were filled with names, dates, and chillingly detailed descriptions of how each man had been disposed of. The last page was dated 2 weeks ago. Her husband's name was scrawled there, underlined, with a note beside it. He didn't scream. Disappointing. James stumbled back, ball rising in his throat. A soft creak behind him froze him in place. He turned slowly, his flashlight shaking. There she stood, her eyes dark, her smile as bright as in the photos. "Detective," she purred, her voice dripping with an eerie calm. "I didn't expect company tonight." The room seemed to close in around him, the smell, the weight of her stare, suffocating. And then she stepped forward, holding something gleaming in her hand. The door slammed shut behind her. James's pulse thundered in his ears as he instinctively reached for his gun. The gleaming object in her hand caught the faint light, a long, sharp kitchen knife. Her smile widened, unnatural and chilling, as she tilted her head like a predator, sizing up its prey. "You shouldn't have come here, detective," she said, her voice honeyed but laced with menace. James leveled his gun at her, his hand shaking. "Drop the knife. Don't make this worse for yourself." She chuckled softly, the sound cold and detached. "You think you understand what's happening here? You're just like the rest of them." She took a step closer, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. "Don't move," James barked, the barrel of his gun unwavering despite the adrenaline flooding his system. But she didn't stop. "I perfected this, you know," she continued, her tone almost conversational. "The hair, the journal, the photographs. I keep it all to remember them. Each one. So unique." James's stomach turned. "You're sick," he spat. "Where's your husband?" She laughed again, this time louder, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. "Oh, you'll meet him soon enough," she whispered. Before he could process her words, she lunged. The knife arced through the air, its blade gleaming menacingly. James fired instinctively, the deafening crack of the gunshot reverberating in the room. She collapsed to the floor with a scream, clutching her leg where the bullet had struck. The knife clattered out of her grasp, spinning across the floor. James rushed forward, pinning her arms as she thrashed and cursed. Her serene mask was gone, replaced by unbridled fury. "You'll never find him," she shrieked, her voice raw and piercing. James radioed for backup, his voice strained but steady. "Suspect subdued. Send forensic teams immediately. As he waited, his eyes wandered back to the chest. The journal, the photographs, the horrifying reality of what he had uncovered began to sink in. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was a carefully crafted nightmare, years in the making. But her words echoed in his mind. You'll never find him. What did she mean? The answer came minutes later when the forensics team pried open a locked compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, they found a body. It was her husband, wrapped in plastic, his face frozen in an expression of terror. James staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The evil he had confronted in that bedroom was beyond comprehension. And as she was dragged away, laughing hysterically, one thought haunted him. How many more had there been? And how close had he come to becoming her next victim? The haunting laughter of the wife echoed down the hall as she was dragged into the waiting police van, her voice a chilling melody that refused to fade. Detective James Carter stood frozen, staring at the grotesque discovery beneath the floorboards. The plastic-wrapped body, so carefully concealed, was more than just evidence. It was a grotesque testament to her calculated evil. The forensic team worked silently, their faces pale under the harsh, sterile lights they had set up. One of the officers approached James, his voice low. "We found something else, sir," he said, holding out a small, weathered key. James took it, the cold metal biting against his palm. "What does it open?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. The officer pointed toward the bedroom closet, its door slightly ajar. James nodded, his legs feeling leaden as he approached the closet. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked open to reveal another chest, smaller, but just as ominous as the one at the foot of the bed. He knelt down, bracing himself, and lifted the lid. Inside were more photographs, but these were different. They showed the woman standing in various locations, parks, streets, coffee shops, always in the background, always watching. And always, her eyes were fixed on men who seemed oblivious to her presence. James flipped through the images, his heart sinking with each one. Each man in these photos was on the list in her journal. She was stalking them. He muttered under his breath, the realization making his skin crawl. Then he reached the final photograph. His blood ran cold. It was a picture of him, taken from a distance, but unmistakably him. He was sitting at a cafe, sipping coffee, completely unaware. A date was scrawled on the back in her meticulous handwriting. Tomorrow. James's breath hitched as the weight of her twisted game settled over him. This wasn't over. Not for her. And now not for him. Her laughter rang in his ears again, as if mocking him even from the depths of the police van. James clenched his fists, his mind racing. She had been planning this all along. The question was no longer if she could strike again. It was whether he could stop her before she did. James stumbled back from the chest, the photograph of himself slipping from his trembling fingers. His breath was ragged, the walls of the room seeming to close in around him. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, hammering against the windows like a warning. He rushed out of the bedroom, ignoring the uneasy glances from the forensic team. "Get her transported to maximum security," he barked into his radio. "She's far more dangerous than we thought." The dispatcher responded with a confirmation, but James barely heard it. He needed air. Stepping outside into the storm, he let the cold rain hit his face, grounding him. But his thoughts raced. How long had she been watching him? Had she been following him to work? To his home? His chest tightened at the thought of her knowing where he lived, where his family lived. Pulling out his phone, he quickly dialed his wife. "Claire, listen to me," he said, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his insides. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone. Keep the kids in the house. I'm sending officers to watch the place." Claire's voice wavered on the other end. "James, what's going on?" "I can't explain right now. Just do it. Please." He hung up before she could press further, his mind already formulating a plan. Back inside, one of the officers approached him. "Detective, we've got her secured in the van, but she's been saying things." James frowned. "What kind of things?" The officer hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if she might hear him. "She keeps repeating, 'Tomorrow, it's his turn,' over and over." James's stomach sank. The photograph. The date. Tomorrow wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Without a word, he stormed toward the police van, his footsteps splashing through the rain-soaked driveway. As he approached, he could hear her voice, soft but deliberate, carrying through the damp night air. "Tick-tock, detective," she whispered, her face pressed against the small, barred window. Her eyes locked onto his, glinting with a mix of madness and satisfaction. "Time's running out?" James clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. "You're done. It's over," he growled, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. "Do you really think so?" she said softly, her voice dripping with mockery. James turned away, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal, and he had less than 24 hours to stop whatever she had planned. James stormed back into the house, his mind racing with possibilities. The photograph of himself burned in his thoughts, each detail replaying like a sinister loop. He needed answers now. Pulling out his phone, he called his trusted tech expert, Officer Miles Grant. "Miles, I need you to pull every scrap of surveillance footage around my usual spots. Work, home, that cafe on 9th. Focus on the last 2 weeks," James ordered, pacing the room. Miles hesitated. "What's going on, James?" "She's been following me," James snapped. "She has a plan, and I don't know how deep this goes. Just do it." He ended the call and turned to the forensic lead, who was carefully cataloging the evidence. "That journal, does it have anything unusual about tomorrow? Anything besides my name?" The lead flipped through the pages, her gloved fingers skimming over the chilling entries. "No, wait," she said, pausing near the end. "There's a line here. The detective is clever, but everyone makes mistakes. The finale will be perfect." James's blood ran cold. Finale. It wasn't just a threat. It was a trap. The pieces clicked together in his mind. She wanted him to react, to chase her game blindly. And she knew him well enough to predict his every move. James slammed his fist onto the nearest table, the frustration boiling over. "We need to recheck everything. Her house, her belongings, her contacts. She's planned this too perfectly for there not to be a backup plan," he barked. His team moved quickly, scouring every inch of the house. James turned back to the chest in the bedroom, forcing himself to confront the horrors it contained. He flipped through the photos again, looking for a pattern. And then he saw it, a location in the background of one of the older photos. A small cabin in the woods, nearly obscured by trees. He recognized it immediately. It was on the outskirts of the city, miles from any main road. He'd visited it once before, years ago during another case. Her smile in the photo seemed to taunt him, as if daring him to come. Grabbing his jacket, James called out to his team. "I think I know where she's leading us. Get back up to the old Miller cabin. We're heading there now." The drive to the cabin was tense, rain slicking the roads and thunder rumbling in the distance. James's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with possibilities. What was waiting for him there? Was it another victim? Another trap? Or something worse? As he approached the overgrown driveway leading to the cabin, his headlights illuminated a chilling sight. The cabin door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. And on the porch, nailed to the wood, was a single photograph. It was of him again, but this time he wasn't alone. His wife and children were in the background, playing in their yard, completely unaware of the camera. James's heart stopped. The finale wasn't about him. It was about them. He leapt out of the car, gun drawn, the darkness swallowing him as he approached the door. Inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, and something else, something faintly metallic. James's flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room, revealing a table in the center. On it was a single note, scrawled in her unmistakable handwriting. "You're too late." His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was Miles. "James, we traced her movements. She's not there. She's at your house." James felt the world tilt as the weight of those words crashed over him. He bolted back to his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped back toward the city, praying he wasn't too late. James's heart raced as he tore down the rain-slicked roads, his mind a blur of fear and desperation. Images of his wife and children flashed before him, laughing, safe, unaware of the horror closing in on them. He dialed Claire again, his hands trembling. Pick up, he muttered through gritted teeth. The line connected, and Claire's voice, soft but confused, came through. James? Claire, listen to me carefully, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Take the kids and get out of the house. Now. Don't pack anything, just go. Lock yourselves in the car and drive to the station. What? James, what's going on? She asked, panic creeping into her tone. She's coming for you, he yelled, the urgency spilling over. Get out, Claire, please. There was a pause, and then he heard it, a faint creak, the sound of a floorboard groaning underweight. James, Claire whispered, her voice trembling. There's someone in the house. His blood ran cold. Lock the bedroom door, he barked. Now! He heard her muffled movements, the sound of the lock clicking into place. Stay quiet, he said, his voice breaking. I'm almost there. The distance to his house felt infinite, the storm battering his car as he pushed it to its limits. His mind replayed every chilling moment with the woman. The journal, the photos, her sinister smile. This was her endgame, and she was playing it perfectly. As he skidded into his driveway, he killed the engine and leapt out, gun drawn. The house was dark, save for a faint light coming from the upstairs bedroom. James moved silently, his boots crunching against the gravel, rain soaking through his clothes. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the familiar warmth replaced by an oppressive chill. Claire, he called out in a hushed voice, his gun sweeping the shadows. No response. He ascended the stairs slowly, each creak of the steps echoing like a gunshot. At the top, the bedroom door stood slightly open, light spilling out into the hallway. James pushed it open with the barrel of his gun, bracing himself for the worst. The room was empty, save for Claire and the kids huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. Relief washed over him as he rushed to them, pulling them into his arms. It's okay. I've got you, he whispered. But then, Claire's trembling hand pointed toward the open window. She was here, she said, her voice barely audible. James turned, his heart pounding, and saw the curtain fluttering in the wind. She was gone, but not before leaving her mark. On the bed was a single photograph, neatly placed on the pillow. It was of James and his family, taken through the very window she had just escaped from, and scrawled across it in red ink were two chilling words. Next time, James clenched the photograph in his hand, his jaw tightening. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as he held his family close, one thought burned in his mind. He would stop her, no matter the cost. James stood frozen, the photograph trembling in his grasp as the weight of the message pressed down on him. Every instinct screamed at him to chase her, but his family came first. He turned back to Claire, his voice firm but gentle. Stay together. I'll have officers here in minutes. Don't open the door for anyone except them. Claire nodded, her eyes filled with fear but trusting his resolve. James kissed her forehead, then crouched to meet his children's frightened gazes. I promise I'll keep you safe, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Leaving them in the locked room was agonizing, but he had to act. Adrenaline surged through him as he stormed back downstairs, calling dispatch. This is Detective Carter. Suspect has fled the scene. Lock down all roads within a 5-mile radius of my address. Deploy all available units. He barked into his radio. The response was immediate, officers confirming their mobilization. James grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The rain blurred his vision, but he scanned the perimeter for any sign of her. A faint set of footprints in the mud caught his eye, leading toward the woods behind his house. He followed them cautiously, his gun raised, every sound amplified by the pounding rain. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy swallowing what little light remained. Branches snapped underfoot as he advanced, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trail led him deeper into the trees until he reached a small clearing. In the center stood a crudely built shack, its structure barely holding against the storm. James's heart pounded as he approached, his grip tightening on his weapon. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of a lantern flickered inside. He steadied his breathing and pushed the door open, revealing a scene that made his stomach churn. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them, all of him and his family. Some were from years ago, others from just days. In the center of the room was a table with a map spread across it, marked with circles around locations he frequented. Pinned to the map was another photograph of his family with today's date written below it. "She's been planning this for months," James muttered, his voice thick with anger. But something felt off. The room was too quiet, too still. A noise behind him made him spin, gun aimed, but it was just the wind slamming the door shut. And then he noticed it, an old tape recorder sitting on the table, a red light blinking. James pressed play, and her voice, calm and mocking, filled the room. "Hello, detective. Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this? You're predictable. That's what makes this so fun." Her laughter crackled through the speaker, sending chills down his spine. "While you're here chasing ghosts, I'm already ahead. But don't worry, I'll see you again soon." The tape ended with a soft click, leaving James alone in the deafening silence. He smashed the recorder against the wall, frustration boiling over. She had slipped through his fingers again. But as he stepped back into the storm, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a game for her anymore. It was war. James stepped out of the shack, his mind a storm of frustration and determination. The rain battered him relentlessly, but he barely noticed, his focus entirely on the trail she had left behind. Even in her taunts, there were clues, tiny breadcrumbs she couldn't resist dropping. He pulled out his phone and dialed Miles again. "I found her hideout in the woods," James said, his voice sharp. "She's mocking us, but she left something behind, a map. It's marked with locations. I'm sending you a photo now." Miles responded instantly, his tone grim. "Got it. I'll cross-reference these locations with known sightings and any recent activity. We'll narrow her down." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. Every move she made was calculated, designed to keep him on edge. But he knew her now, understood her patterns. This was her playground, but he wasn't just another piece on her board. He was the one who would end the game. As he trudged back through the woods, a memory surfaced, a conversation he'd had with her during one of the interrogations. She'd spoken cryptically about finishing what was started, her words laced with malice and satisfaction. At the time, he dismissed it as another one of her games. But now it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him back to the present. It was Miles. "James, I've got something." One of the marked locations matches a recently purchased property under an alias we tied to her. "It's a storage facility on the outskirts of town," Miles said. "Send me the address," James replied, already heading for his car. The drive to the storage facility was tense, every second feeling like an eternity. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the events of the night in his head. She was always one step ahead, but this time, he wouldn't let her slip away. When he arrived, the facility was eerily quiet, its rows of units stretching into the darkness. He parked outside and called for backup, knowing better than to go in alone. As he waited, his eyes scanned the area, searching for any signs of movement. A faint light flickered in one of the units, barely visible through the heavy rain. James's instincts kicked in. He approached cautiously, gun drawn, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The closer he got, the more he could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the unit. He reached the door and paused, his heart pounding. With one swift motion, he flung it open, his flashlight illuminating the space. Inside was another chilling scene. The walls were lined with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all centered around him and his family. At the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a single box, sealed with tape. The tapping sound grew louder, coming from inside the box. James's pulse quickened as he slowly approached, his flashlight shaking slightly. He took a deep breath and cut the tape, lifting the lid. Inside was an old alarm clock, its hands ticking down rapidly. And beneath it was another note, scrawled in her haunting handwriting. "Time's up, detective." The alarm clock let out a piercing ring, echoing through the storage unit as James backed away, his mind racing. Was this another taunt, or something far worse? Before he could decide, a low rumble shook the ground beneath him. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough to send him sprawling outside, the shockwave ringing in his ears. As he scrambled to his feet, coughing from the smoke, he saw her figure in the distance, silhouetted against the rain. She stood there for a moment, watching him. Then, with a mocking wave, she vanished into the darkness. James shouted after her, but it was no use. She was gone again, but not for long, because now it wasn't just a hunt. It was personal. James stood in the smoke-filled aftermath of the explosion, his chest heaving as he watched the spot where she had stood moments ago. He could barely hear himself think over the ringing in his ears. But something deep inside him knew she hadn't just escaped. She had left him with one last clue. The explosion wasn't random. It was a message, a warning. James staggered to his feet, wiping debris from his face, his mind already racing. He couldn't afford to waste another second. She was playing him like a puppet, but the strings were getting shorter. He pulled out his phone, fingers shaky as he dialed Miles. "Get every unit you have to the facility. I need a full sweep. Check for anything she left behind. And pull the city's surveillance footage. She's watching Miles." "I know it." Miles's voice was strained. "We'll move fast, James. But you need to stay focused. We're getting closer." James didn't respond. He was already heading back to his car. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the streets blurred in a sheet of water as he drove. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble. But one thing stood clear. He had to get ahead of her, take control of the game. Back at the police station, his team worked in overdrive, combing through evidence and making connections that might lead to her. James's mind kept returning to the clock, the ticking sound. It wasn't just a countdown. It was a reflection of everything she had planned. Every moment, every clue, every taunt had been meticulously designed to break him. He wouldn't let it. By morning, he was back at the storage facility, piecing together fragments of evidence. The explosion had destroyed most of her setup, but there were still traces left. Notes, photographs, and the remnants of a map. There was one marked location on the map he hadn't yet explored, a house on the outskirts of town, far from anything familiar. A chill ran down his spine as he studied it, the realization dawning. This was where she had been hiding all along. The storm was finally letting up, but the oppressive weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. James rallied his team, and they set out immediately for the house. As they approached, a sense of dread crept over him. The house was isolated, nestled between thick trees, the perfect place for a trap. And as they neared the entrance, the door creaked open on its own. James signaled for his team to hold back. "Stay alert," he whispered, his voice low. Every step inside felt like it was taking him deeper into her web. The interior was stark, almost clinical in its emptiness. But then his flashlight caught something, a large mirror on the far wall, covered in scribbles and markings. The closer he got, the clearer the message became. It wasn't just random words. It was a map that led directly to his family's house. James froze, his blood running cold. She had already planned her next move. His mind raced, calculating the distance between here and home. "She's going after them," he muttered under his breath. Without wasting another second, he sprinted back to his car, heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached the driveway, a sense of dread hit him like a brick. He wasn't fast enough. The lights in his home were flickering, and the front door was wide open. James's breath hitched as he saw the door wide open, the ominous glow of the flickering lights spilling out into the night. A gut-wrenching fear gripped him, but he pushed it aside. His family. He had to reach them. He bolted out of the car, his gun drawn, his heart hammering in his chest. Every step toward the house felt like a slow-motion nightmare. He called out, but his voice cracked, swallowed by the howling wind. "Claire! Kids!" No response. His boots pounded on the porch, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. He kicked the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The house was eerily silent, the usual warmth and familiarity replaced by a cold, unsettling stillness. He moved through the hallway, every nerve on edge, his eyes scanning every corner. There was no sign of life, but something was wrong. The house had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out, and emptied. The family photos on the walls had been torn or defaced, a chilling message written across the glass of the largest frame. "You're too late." James's stomach churned as he moved deeper into the house. "Claire!" he shouted, panic clawing at his throat. His voice echoed in the empty rooms, each sound amplifying his growing fear. Finally, he reached the bedroom. The door was ajar, the room in chaos. But there, lying on the bed, was something that made his blood run cold. A doll. A doll that looked exactly like his daughter. Its eyes were wide and glassy, staring at nothing, but in its tiny hands was a note. James reached out, trembling as he grabbed the note. It read, "Game over. See you soon." His hands shook violently as he read the words again, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. She had taken them. His family was gone, and it was his fault. His eyes blurred with frustration and fear as he clenched the note in his hand. She was toying with him, dragging him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling, and saw a message from Miles. "We've found her. She's at the old warehouse near the docks. Bring backup." The words barely registered before James slammed the phone shut and headed for the door. His family had been taken. He wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not ever. The warehouse loomed ahead as James sped toward it, his mind set on one thing only: finding his family, no matter the cost. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. This time, she would face the consequences, and he would make sure of it.
James's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced as he drove toward the warehouse. Each minute felt like an eternity, every passing moment a step closer to an unknown terror. He could feel her presence, like a shadow looming just out of reach, always one step ahead, always calculating. But this time there would be no more games. This time he was in control. The warehouse appeared through the rain-soaked night, its tall, rusting walls looming like a fortress. James parked a little further down the road, his eyes scanning the perimeter. There were no lights, no signs of life, but he knew better than to assume she wasn't watching. He checked his weapon, making sure it was loaded and ready. His mind was calm now, his fear replaced by a cold resolve. He wasn't going to let her hurt his family any longer. James moved swiftly, staying low, his body pressed against the shadows as he approached the main entrance. The air smelled of oil and rust, heavy with the scent of something that had long been abandoned. Every creak of the floor beneath him, every gust of wind through the broken windows, felt like it could be a trap. As he rounded the corner, he saw it, the faint glow of a lantern flickering from within the building. His pulse quickened. He moved closer, his eyes darting around as he crept toward the entrance. The door was cracked open, just enough for him to slip inside. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the darkness. The warehouse was vast, its high ceilings stretching above him like a cavern. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, making every corner seem like a potential threat. He moved cautiously, every step measured, his ears straining for any sound that might give away her position. And then he heard it, the softest of noises. A giggle. A low, eerie sound that sent a chill down his spine. It came from the far side of the room. James's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing. He crept forward, his gun raised, until he reached the source of the sound. And then he saw them. Claire and the kids, bound and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. They were unharmed, but their terror was palpable, their bodies trembling. James moved to them in an instant, his hands trembling as he untied the ropes that bound them. "Claire," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her face streaked with tears. "I was so scared, James," she sobbed. "I know," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "I know. You're safe now. We're getting out of here." But as he moved to untie the children, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A sense of dread hung heavy in the air, and James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And then, from the shadows, she appeared. Her figure was silhouetted against the dim light, her eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "You're too late, detective," she said, her voice smooth and cold. James spun around, his gun raised, but she was already gone, slipping back into the darkness before he could even fire. The warehouse seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing deeper. His mind raced.
She was playing him again.
This wasn't over. He turned back to Claire and the kids, his voice urgent. "Get to the car.
Now."
But just as they began to move, the ground shook beneath their feet. A deafening crash followed, and the entire building seemed to groan in protest. Something had triggered the collapse, and it was coming down fast.
"Go."
"Go," James shouted, pulling Claire and the kids toward the exit. The roof above them cracked and splintered, debris raining down as they sprinted toward the door. They were almost there when the entire wall beside them exploded in a shower of concrete and metal. James threw himself on top of his family, shielding them as the shockwave hit. When the dust cleared, James's vision swam. His head pounded with pain, but his eyes snapped open. Claire, the kids, they were all okay. But she was gone. She had vanished into the wreckage, once again slipping through his fingers. James's chest heaved as he stood, pulling his family to safety. It wasn't over yet. He didn't know where she was or how long she had been watching, but one thing was clear. The game had just begun. James stood in the wreckage, his heart racing as he surveyed the scene. The warehouse was crumbling around them, the walls buckling and groaning under the weight of the destruction.
His family was safe for now.
But she was still out there, still playing her twisted game. His mind raced, but he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had to get them out, away from this nightmare. He looked at Claire, her face pale but relieved, clutching the kids close. "We're not safe yet," he whispered urgently, his voice tense. She nodded, fear flashing in her eyes. James motioned for them to follow, leading them through the shattered doorway, back into the rain-soaked night. Every step felt like it could be their last. They had to get out of this place before it all came crashing down. Once outside, James took a deep breath, his pulse still racing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Miles. "James," he said, his voice tight. "We've got something." Surveillance footage from the docks. "It looks like she's headed for the old mansion at the edge of town. We've traced a route, but we need you to confirm." James's heart skipped a beat. The old mansion. It was a place he hadn't thought about in years. A place that had long been abandoned. But now it was her sanctuary. The realization hit him like a freight train. She had been planning this from the very beginning. "I'm on my way," James replied, hanging up without another word. He turned to Claire, his face grim. "Stay here with the kids. I'll go." "No, James," Claire pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Please, don't go alone." But he could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about their family, their future. "I'll be back," he promised, forcing a smile. And then, without another word, he turned and sprinted to his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped toward the mansion. The wind whipped around him as he drove, the rain now a relentless torrent, blurring the road ahead. His mind was consumed by one thought. This was it. This was the endgame. As he approached the mansion, he could see the faint glow of a light flickering in the distance. It was coming from the highest window, casting an eerie shadow over the crumbling stone walls. James slowed the car, parking just out of sight. He exited quietly, his senses alert, every muscle tensed. This was her final act, he knew, and he was done letting her control the game. He moved swiftly toward the mansion's entrance, the door slightly ajar. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This time, he would end it. Inside, the mansion was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. Every step echoed through the vast, empty halls, the silence pressing in on him. Then he heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She was here. He crept forward, following the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the grand staircase and looked up. And there she was, standing at the top, silhouetted against the faint light. She smiled, a twisted, knowing smile that made his stomach turn. "Did you really think you could win, Detective?" she called down to him. James's hand tightened on his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I didn't come here to play," he said, his voice steady. She tilted her head, her smile never fading. "I know," she whispered, almost gleefully. "That's what makes it so much fun." The last thing James heard before everything went black was the sound of her laughter. James's world was plunged into darkness, the sound of her laughter echoing in his ears as everything seemed to fade away. His vision blurred, his head throbbing with intense pain. He could feel the cold stone beneath him, the damp air pressing against his skin. For a moment, he thought he had lost consciousness, but a sharp pain in his side told him he was still alive. With every ounce of strength he had left, he forced his eyes open. The mansion around him was still dark, but the light from above flickered, casting long shadows across the room. He was on the floor, disoriented, struggling to regain his bearings. But then he heard her voice again. "Welcome to my final act, Detective," she said, her tone filled with twisted amusement. James's heart pounded as he pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He had to find her. He had to end this, once and for all. Using the wall for support, he staggered to his feet, every step feeling like a battle against the pain. And then he saw her, standing at the far end of the room, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. She was waiting, but this time James was ready. He straightened his posture, his hand still gripping his gun, his focus sharp. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice low and steady, despite the pounding in his head. "This ends tonight." She laughed softly, almost mockingly, but there was something else in her eyes. Fear. She didn't expect him to fight back like this. "Do you really think you can stop me now?" she taunted.
James didn't respond.
He was done talking. He moved quickly, using the shadows to his advantage as he advanced toward her, his step silent but calculated. She wasn't just a criminal anymore. She was a symbol of everything he had been fighting against. And he wasn't going to let her win. With a swift motion, he lunged, aiming for her with precision. But she was faster. In a blur, she ducked behind a pillar, disappearing into the darkness. James didn't hesitate. He kept moving, his mind honed in on one thing: finding her. His footsteps were now steady, his breath controlled, each sense heightened to a razor-sharp edge. The mansion felt alive with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Suddenly, the sound of something shifting caught his attention, a low creak, followed by the soft scuffle of feet on the old wood floor. She was close. He turned sharply, his gun raised, but the figure he saw was not hers. It was a mannequin. James froze, realizing too late that he had fallen into her trap. The room was filled with life-size mannequins, all dressed in clothes eerily similar to his family's. A sickening realization hit him. She had been playing him, using his greatest fear, his family, against him. The mannequins were lifeless, their faces blank, but their presence in that moment was enough to send a shiver down his spine. "You see, Detective," her voice echoed through the room, "I've always been one step ahead. You never stood a chance." James spun around, searching for her in the shadows, his pulse racing. But she was gone. The room fell silent. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to think. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her break him. As he moved forward, scanning every corner, a cold, sharp pain suddenly flared in his side. He gasped, stumbling, his hand clutching at the wound. She had gotten to him, but he wouldn't give in.
Not now.
Not when he was so close. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay upright, his determination burning brighter than ever. With a final, desperate burst of energy, he reached the far end of the room. And there she was, standing in the shadows, watching him with a smirk on her face. "Game over, Detective," she whispered. James didn't hesitate. He charged, his mind focused solely on stopping her once and for all. She took a step back, but in that moment, James lunged forward. This time, he wouldn't let her slip away. James's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance between them. The darkness around him seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to think, but there was no time for second-guessing. This was it, the final confrontation. She was backing away, a look of surprise flashing across her cold features as she realized he wasn't stopping. The shadows danced around them, the dim light from the broken windows casting strange, flickering patterns on the floor. But James could see her clearly now, her twisted grin, her eyes that had once been filled with calculated amusement, now flickering with fear. You don't get it, do you?" she sneered, trying to regain control. "You're too late. This was never about winning. It was about the game, about watching you break." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. Every step he took was a silent promise that he would stop her, no matter the cost. With one final, desperate movement, he lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm, forcing her to the ground. Her surprised gasp was drowned out by the crash of debris from above, the mansion groaning under the pressure of time and decay. But James didn't care. The only thing that mattered was this moment, the end of her twisted reign. He pressed the cold barrel of the gun against her chest, his breath heavy. She stared up at him, her defiant smile faltering. "You failed," James said quietly, his voice raw but resolute. "This ends now." The last flicker of arrogance in her eyes faded, replaced by something far darker, fear. The power she had held over him, over his family, was crumbling. In one swift motion, he disabled the mechanism that had been keeping her hidden in the shadows, allowing the light from the windows to flood the room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She lay there, trapped by her own game. And James, standing tall, realized the weight of everything he had fought for, his family, his strength, his resolve. "Let's go home," he whispered to the lifeless shadows of the mansion. As the authorities arrived to take her away, James could finally breathe again. The nightmare was over. The game was done, and his family, who had been the very reason for his survival, were safe once more. The world would move on, but for James, the victory was simple: the love of his family and the peace that now came with knowing she could never harm them again. He didn't need to chase shadows anymore. The light had finally won.